So thank you very much. I have to say I'm not going to say one word about brain-computer interfaces because I was originally in the IU-we session, so I'm going to talk about ethics, but not brains. Although I love brains and I can talk about them with more. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the two things I am going to talk about are the origins of cooperation, and then I'll talk about AI, including AGI. So I think when you're trying to understand ethics, you have to understand that any one life can be fragile, but life itself is not fragile, right? So life is the, did I say this? Yeah, life is the algorithm that perpetuates itself. It is literally, of all the chemicals that sort of, happen to make soup at some point, this was the ones that could figure out how to make enough copies of themselves, but not only simple copies, that could also figure out other ways to be robust, all right? So a lot of people are afraid of death. One way to think about death is it's a loss of memory. So if you've been doing a lot of computation as an individual, all those things that you've learned, all that extra kind of intelligence that you could do is gone, all right? So when we're thinking about learning in general, there's three things that you have to have. One is some way of representing the information, that you're storing it. And then another is, if you're an intelligent agency, right, you also have to weigh some way to act on it, right? Something that, given what you've known so far, you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is next, all right? And then third, and this finally, you need some way of checking how things were going and seeing if you were doing the right kind of thing. So every learning system needs these three pieces. And it really, really matters how you represent information. Does anyone know what this is? Shout, shout. No one's going to guess. You don't have to guess exactly which planet it is, but the point is it's in retrograde. It's Mars, in fact, in retrograde. And so there was a long time where people spent, the scientists of their day, or astronomers, astrologers, could predict perfectly, when were the planets going to go backwards and what were they doing. But it got a lot easier when Copernicus came up with this, right? So it wasn't that the planets were sometimes going backwards. We didn't have to explain that. It was that we were all going in a circle, but not around the Earth, okay? It just looks like things are going around the Earth. So representations really matter. If you have the right representation, you can learn a lot more, a lot faster. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Darwin. The main thing he was trying to do was understand where species came from, right? So after observing a few birds that looked like they almost could have descended from each other, he came up with this theory, which is that animals tend to produce more offspring than they themselves survive to reproduce. So of all your offspring, not all of them will make it, and they're different from each other, although they're more like their parents than an average member of the same species, right? So finally, the individuals most fit to their environment are the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. You can't guarantee this, bad things happen, but this is enough when you take these together that you eventually change towards something and you can wind up having specializations, basically. It's a very short version. There's a lot more going on. But the reason that I bring this, I forgot, one more slide. That was the simpler version. Now we talk about it in different terms. So evolution requires variation. That's that differencing. Reproduction, that is like the imperfect copy of your parents. And selection, some kind of filter that determines what gets to go. And whenever you have these conditions, you get change. You're optimizing to whatever the selection criteria forces you towards, okay? And so this is something that's really a very powerful way of learning, right? You're using concurrency. So you can think of the ecosystem as altogether, we are learning how to perpetuate ourselves into the future, back to us being alive, right? So, and Dennett has a nice book about this, where he calls evolution the universal acid, this desire to keep perpetuating. All right, so how do we learn to be resilient? I've said we needed these pieces. If we think about evolution, we can think about the genome, famously as the replicator, right? Living as interaction, with reality. So that's the thing that we're doing, just seeing can we persist and reproduce. And then finally, as I just mentioned, surviving to reproduction is the selection criteria. But I want to point out that this makes it sound like everything that we're related to is our biological relatives, right? Oh, sorry. So all these things together is evolving. But I mentioned this is what I just said. There's actually more to identity, at least for humans, than DNA, all right? So we don't just talk about the genome anymore. We talk about anything that replicates. And I brought this all up because I was told this meeting was not only science, but also art. And so I wanted to bring in this, if we're talking about cooperation, it's useful to think about the fact that we construct an identity, right? That we can find new groups of people that we're going to find easy to cooperate with, to understand through art, all right? So identity is something that can extend beyond genetics. We can sacrifice ourselves not just for our biological relatives, but for others who also believe in sacrificing themselves, right? There has to be some commonality, and the main one has to be that we would be as cooperative as each other, okay? Also notice that political crises shift our senses of identities. So if you have an economic crisis and people find that they don't have enough to survive, that can make them feel less a part of their nation. They say, my nation isn't taking care of me, and you get polarization. On the other hand, if you have an attack from, like, say, a neighbor, then all of a sudden your national identity can become very strong. And you can say, my nation is protecting me, and this is a big part of who I am, okay? So what does all that got to do? I think I may have cut out the thing about the origins of cooperation. Yeah, let me just tell you this without a slide. So the whole point is that you're willing to pay a cost to benefit others as long as the benefit that they get is bigger than the cost you pay when you multiply it by how related they are to you, okay? So that's, and evolution can easily solve that problem. And if we didn't have that, you wouldn't have children. Because trust me, children are really, really costly, especially for women, but for everybody, right? They're there, they're competing with you. Why would you do that? Because you've evolved to help perpetuate what it is to be the kind of organism with the genes you have. There are no single gene organisms. People think that competition is the way Darwin described the world, but every single organism is cooperating. We're all full of multiple cells, and we have multiple genes in each of those cells, and we all tend to create, especially us mammals, tend to create offspring, right? And to cooperate with some other individual to create the offspring, usually cooperative, not always. Okay, so now let's get on to AI. So one of the things people forget, especially when they're afraid of AGI or something, is that computation is itself a systematic transformation of information, right? As I was just talking about, and in fact, we heard the morning about getting perception into action, right? When you transform information, it's a physical process. It takes time, space, and energy, and also infrastructure, all right? So a lot of people confuse computation with math. Math is this perfect abstraction. It's true. You can prove things about it. With computation, you have to go out and plug something in. And if you want to do something really complicated, you have to buy more RAM, right? You need the space to write it down, okay? So this is the kind of thing that makes it impossible to be omniscient. Basically, there's something called, and I don't know why it's called this, but the map of Germany problem. The perfect map of Germany would be exactly the same size as Germany, all right? That's useless, right? Basically, you can think of every intelligent animal as a little tiny map on the universe, right? It has a set of things it can perceive and a set of things it can do. And if it's a biological agent, the main thing it's trying to do in the end that gets reinforced, the ultimate goal is perpetuation of the genes it's carrying, of its replicators, not of itself, because every individual is fragile, right? We're trying to keep the whole system going. All right, so intelligence is the subset of computation that is specifically about doing that, right? Getting the actions from the context. And I just mentioned all this about the intelligent agents only perceive a subset of the universe. They're representing it, and they're predicting whether or not their action is good enough. And maybe, by this definition, plants are intelligent. They can detect the sun and grow towards them, but they're not really learning, unless you want to call it learning that they're moving towards where the sun is, right? But for more cognitive agents, at least you have the components there, and you can update, and you can actually learn. Okay, so I want to say something quickly about infrastructure. We'll come back when we talk about ethics and AI. Google uses only its own fiber optic network, which wraps the entire Earth. Okay, why? It found out its own government was hacking it, right? That they found out from Snowden that even though it was cooperating with the NSA had hacked it. So it doesn't trust anyone. It keeps track of its own. It makes its own chips, which until recently the EU didn't do, right? And it buys giant infrastructure to create the power centers and the data centers. So a lot of people get into a panic about, Google has all the algorithms, and then they start giving away the algorithms. And now they're talking about, Google has all the data. But don't forget, and I don't want to pick on just Google here, all of this big tech is an enormous amount of physical infrastructure, okay? It's much more than just algorithms or data. These are large companies that are producing the stuff that we use. Okay, so continuing on with the definitions I was just going, I made it really easy to talk about artificial intelligence. If you buy that definition I gave you before, which incidentally is one of the oldest definitions of intelligence, it's like more than a century old. It was used when we were first trying to understand animal intelligence after Darwin finished his stuff, right? So artificial intelligence is intelligence deliberately built. That means someone is responsible for it. Now, a lot of people think this isn't what I meant by intelligence. I want to talk about agency. Again, there's lots of definitions, but just to keep super clear, I like the definition of agency that we use, for example, in chemistry. An agent is anything that changes its environment, okay? So that's not the big deal. This is the big deal. I'll stop stringing you along. What we really care about is moral agency. Who is it that is responsible for what they do, okay? And now notice that that isn't a global truth. Like everything else here, it's just out there. But we don't agree about this between societies. We don't agree at what age you're an adult. We don't agree at what age you can consent to sex. We don't agree at what age you can fight in a war, right? And the same society may change its mind about, for example, how old you have to be to fight in a war, depending on their context. Sometimes they have to make adjustments. We had to make adjustments during COVID about how often we went out and who we talked to and things like that. Right, so that's half of what you care about. The other half is you care about who those who are responsible for. And again, with both of these, there's some almost universals. For example, taking care of babies. But there's differences of opinion about, for example, is the environment a moral patient, right? So that is also social. So all of this you could look up in a dictionary, but I'm now going to say something that at least used to be controversial a few years ago. I'm going to say that because moral agency and moral patiency are both dependent on a society, ethics itself is also specific to a society. And furthermore, I'm going to argue that ethics almost determines a society. It defines a society, all right? And we're always trying to improve it. We're always trying to find a better way to make our society more resilient, and we call that resilience fairness, okay? So we keep trying to do better. So ask me if you want in Q&A. I'm trying to go fast enough that we can do that, why that was controversial. But now people tend to say, in fact, they even say, these big tech companies talk about ethics knowing that it's socially determined, and if they really cared about doing the right thing, they would talk about human rights instead. But it used to be people did it, they wanted to believe there was one ethical system. All this is saying is that, I did finish this, sorry. All this is saying is if you want to say you're more ethical, you have to say on what grounds. So we are more ethical than we were in the 1950s if you look at the fact that the number of children who make it past the age of 5 globally has gone from, it used to be 55% of them died globally before the age of 5. Now it's 3%. So I would say globally we've become more ethical because we all care about the well-being of children. All right, so I would argue also that responsibility is possibly the property of moral agents. We're actually saying what is a society? It's the group of people that are responsible, and responsible means they have obligations to each other, all right? So this is the main thing we worry about when we worry about AI. Who is responsible for what? Is there some new thing that's intervened into the system that now holds the responsibility, or that we now have responsibility towards? But I would say that responsibility as a concept implies a peer relationship, because the whole point of it is that the society can enforce responsibility on its members. Okay, so you don't have to be perfect peers. Some people have more power than others. But there has to be some way to hold others to account. And accountability is the main thing that we want in our systems. Transparency is just one means to achieve that, right? But we want to know that we can trace accountability and enforce responsibility on the people that have obligations to us. Okay, I've been going a little too slow, so I apologize. I will speed up. Sorry, non-native English speakers. Okay, so coming back to Berlin, where I work, robots are not our peers. We design them and we own them, okay? I was astounded when I first heard that we now consider that every child that was born to a slave was born of rape, right? I said, why take away what little agency a slave has and say that slave can't consent to sex? But the idea is that the power relationship makes such consent meaningless. And you know this is also why you're not supposed to have sex with like professors and students or something. You may feel in love, but the power is such that you can't trust that feeling, right? The power dynamic. So anyway, robots are also either physically or behaviorally fragile, although we did see some hopeful things for teleoperated robots this morning. The right way to think about robots, I would argue, is extensions of those corporations we were talking about. You have cameras and microphones in your home that are basically extensions of, Apple or Amazon or Google, right? And so this is a new paper where I argue it doesn't make sense to think about AI as a collaborator, right? Realize that the people you're working with are actually your own company to the extent they have control over the AI, in some kind of combination with whoever developed and designed the AI. Making sure that we can keep those corporations at some kind of peer-like scale is the original reason for antitrust, or in Europe we call this competition law, right? But we want to make sure that the corporations are small enough, and the individuals within the corporations are sufficiently unpowerful that our democracies can regulate them. That was the goal. Okay, so can AI help us cooperate? Now, here's the cooperation slide. I just forgot what order I put this in. Sorry about that. So fundamentally, life has two problems: sustainability and fairness, right? Persistence and fairness. And we're going to use the pie metaphor, but because I'm woke, I am not going to talk about growing the pie. I'm going to talk about making it more rich or beneficial, okay? So sustainability is about how beneficial is the pie overall, right? Fairness is about, does everyone have a big enough slice to live on? And can they actually flourish, right? So cooperation improves the entire pie. Competition improves some slice at a cost to others. Was that 5 minutes before the questions, or was that 5 minutes before the end? Uh-oh. Okay, so now I really have to go fast. So we cooperate when we can find a way to improve the pie with an apparent better cost, benefiting than competing, right? So that we're choosing whether to compete or to cooperate. How many minutes do I have now? 1. Okay. So anyway, that's true. Okay, so AI is a very good way to help us find ways to cooperate. So there's a question that people have with AGI about whether these things are competing with us. I'm going to argue that we've had AI for 10,000 years because we have been using it to help us think. And these predictions people have made about superintelligence, this thing about, if it can learn how to learn, it's going to go exponential on an exponential. We have that. This is our numbers on an exponential scale. We are the paperclips, okay? Right? And that has unintended consequences, which includes wiping out every other large mammal. So the green were the wild animals in about 2004, right? The big gray in the middle is the amount of biomass of mammals that are human, and everything else is stuff we eat or play with, okay? And of course, some of the other unanticipated consequences have been fairness failures. Okay, so do the robots care? Not as much as cows do, okay? So it's hard to say how much when you're drawing a diagram and you're saying how much is this suffering. That's hard to draw a line, but I can tell you that if you're worried about phenomenological experience similar to your own, based on the things we were seeing earlier, and this matches very well into the second talk, the phenomenological experience of even fruit flies with their little hairs and their little drives to compete and things like that is more like ours than something we're going to build out of wires and silicon. So we author and architect the experience of AI anyway, so even given that we own and we shouldn't want it, then that was in the talk we were talking about before, we shouldn't want to build people anyway because we're going to own them and we know that that's wrong. You don't want to own people. Okay, so I'll skip over the UN, but just trust me. And so thank you.